You are the royal physician in the Madrid palace in the year 1834. The king has passed away, but your duty is far from over. You have been called to the private chambers of the late Frederick II for an assignment so strange and never before encountered that you begin to doubt your own reason. Queen Regent Mary Christine stands before you with tears streaming down her face, making a request that sends a cold shiver through your body. Your hands shake as you approach the bed where Frederick's lifeless body rests. Even in death, the man who ruled Spain with terror for 2 decades seems to sneer at you from beyond the veil. Yet it is not his visage that captures your gaze. It is what is hidden beneath the luxurious silk covers. That peculiar feature that defined his reign as much as his cruelty, his deep suspicion, or his acts of treason. The anatomical abnormality that would become a whispered legend among historians, too fearful to include it in official records. Frederick's 7th member, grotesquely large and oddly shaped, was both his greatest shame and his most twisted source of pride. As you begin the delicate preservation, your thoughts drift to the rumors you faintly caught along the palace halls. Tales of peculiar cushions, anguished wives' screams, and relentless efforts to produce an heir despite nature's cruel irony. You realize you are not merely preserving flesh and bone. You are guarding the very physical symbol of a reign that itself was malformed, overwhelmingly large, and ultimately ruinous to all it encountered. Before we delve into these overlooked tales of endurance and hardship, if you enjoy uncovering hidden historical truths, consider pressing the like button and subscribing for more videos like this. Also, please share in the comments where you are tuning in from. It is amazing that we are discovering these ancient narratives together from diverse regions of the globe, united through time and space by our common passion for the past. To truly grasp Frederick VII, one must realize he was born under a curse. Not one cast by magic or divine punishment, but a harmful legacy born from countless years of royal family intermarriages. The Spanish Habsburgs and Bourbons had spent many generations uniting cousins with cousins, uncles with nieces, weaving a genetic snare that resulted in issues ranging from mental instability to visible physical defects. Frederick came from this poisonous heritage as a living symbol of the decay within royalty. Born in the Escorial Palace on the 14th of October, 1784, he was the offspring of Charles IV and Mary Louise Palmer. Their marriage itself was a strategic bond between first cousins. From the moment of conception, the genetic deck was stacked against Frederick, and he suffered the consequences in deeply personal and embarrassing ways. As he matured from a young boy to a teenager, it became apparent that fate had played a merciless trick on Spain's next monarch. His body developed features that baffled contemporary medical experts. By the time he reached his adolescence, the royal physicians at court were already struggling to understand the unusual changes occurring with his physical development. Whispers surrounded the unusual royal peculiarity, a member so enormous and oddly shaped that it seemed almost otherworldly in its proportions. Medical documents from the era, long concealed within the Vatican archives, provide clinical descriptions of Frederick's endowment that nonetheless reveal the distress caused by his condition. One doctor noted, "His Royal Highness suffers from an organ of such remarkable size and unusual shape that intimate encounters might be difficult." Another physician was even more explicit. "The prince's appendage is akin to a billiard cue, slender, like sealing wax near the base, yet as thick as a man's fist at the tip, and long enough to be used as a cane." The emotional toll on the young Frederick was immense. During a period when male beauty was judged by classical Greek ideals, favoring smaller size as more elegant and noble, Frederick's enormous endowment branded him as an anomaly. What might elicit envy from contemporary men became a deep source of humiliation for the future monarch of Spain. His early years were a tale of dysfunction that would have crushed a lesser individual, but instead shaped a despotic ruler. Frederick's father, Charles IV, lacked resolve and preferred hunting over governance. His mother, Mary Louise, was a woman of insatiable desires who shamelessly displayed her affair with Michael Godfrey, Spain's unofficial leader. Young Frederick witnessed this daily disgrace, internalizing bitter lessons about authority, betrayal, and the fragility of trust. Yet it was his physical, an unusual trait truly forged his personality. The court was alive with murmurs about the prince's condition. Servants whispered behind cupped hands, courtiers shared veiled jests, and foreign envoys relayed the news to their superiors about the Spanish scandal. Frederick realized early on that he was a figure of ridicule, that his most private self became a source of entertainment for others. This shame fostered a deep and simmering bitterness, which later influenced his harsh attitude toward Spain itself. Frederick started perceiving mockery everywhere, in the respectful gestures of his subjects, in the formal salutations of his instructors, in the forced smiles of potential brides. His suspicion was not entirely baseless. People were indeed laughing at him, though not always for the reasons he assumed. The prince's teachers observed troubling shifts in his conduct as he grew into his teenage years. He became secretive, resentful, and harsh toward those serving him, servants who displeased him. Faced dismissal or worse, Frederick was learning to wield the authority of his rank to make up for the helplessness he felt about his own body. One notable episode mentioned in the memoirs of a royal chaplain illustrates the growing darkness within Frederick's heart. When a young page unintentionally saw the prince changing clothes, Frederick did not simply send him away. He ordered the boy to be beaten and his family banished from Madrid. The warning was unmistakable. No one was allowed to witness the prince's disgrace, and as Frederick reached the age appropriate for marriage, the full scope of his anatomical challenge became evident to the royal medical team. Dr. Francisco Flores, the king's private physician, left behind confidential notes that reveal a troubling insight into Frederick's condition. His Majesty's member, Dr. Flores described, exhibits an extraordinary configuration. The base measures no more than the width of a man's thumb, yet expands to a circumference that defies normal proportions. Its length surpasses that of any documented human specimen, measuring close to 10 inches in its natural state and increasing significantly when aroused. Most alarming is its unusual curvature and the presence of what seem to be additional tissue growths without any apparent biological purpose. The consequences for Frederick's future domestic life were immediately clear. Ordinary intimate relations would be impossible without major medical assistance and custom-made equipment. Royal artisans were discreetly tasked with producing what they discreetly termed marital aids, specially crafted cushions and supports designed to enable Frederick to engage in sexual activity without inflicting serious harm on his prospective wives. Yet the physical difficulties represented only a fraction of the issue. Frederick's condition also carried psychological effects far beyond the private sphere. He developed an obsession with potions and elixirs that, secretly summoned to Madrid, court alchemists and foreign doctors each promised extraordinary cures to either correct his physique or boost his fertility, yet all attempts proved futile. The prince poured vast sums into these dubious remedies, consuming blends containing powdered rhinoceros horn, crushed pearls, and exotic herbs rumored to recalibrate his regal potency. Some elixirs claimed to reduce his member to conventional dimensions, while others boasted increased virility despite its unusual form. None delivered results. However, Frederick's desperation made him vulnerable to fraudsters and tricksters seeking to exploit his hopes. In the year 1802, Frederick wedded his first cousin, Princess Mary Christine of Naples and Sicily. Their marriage was arranged during adolescence, and Mary Christine arrived in Madrid harboring idyllic expectations about her husband. She had heard whispers that he was called the Desired One by his admirers and envisioned a fairy tale romance. The ceremony itself was splendid, befitting the alliance of two royal dynasties, with the cathedral alive with melodies and the streets celebrating joyously. The young pair appeared to be a flawless royal match. Mary Christine was graceful, intelligent, and sincerely enthusiastic about her new life. Frederick, in public, seemed nearly ordinary, charming, thoughtful, and suitably amorous. Yet, as with all royal weddings, the festivities concluded and the wedding night arrived, bringing the first indication of difficulties when Frederick's personal attendant approached Mary Christine. Antonia's attendants brought forth an unusual demand. Special arrangements had to be made for the royal sleeping chamber, with items that puzzled the ladies yet were assured to be traditional for sovereign couples. Tailored cushions were delivered, accompanied by bottles of oils, candles, and various tools that appeared more medical than affectionate. Mary Christine, sheltered and naive like most princesses of her time, had no understanding of these matters. Her upbringing was deeply religious, concentrating on languages, music, and court manners. The fundamental aspects of married life had only been outlined in the vaguest terms by anxious older women who themselves were unfamiliar with the unique struggles she was about to encounter. When Frederick stepped into the bridal chamber, Mary Christine caught sight of her husband's naked body and immediately became frantic. An attendant recounted the event years later. The queen began to scream as though she faced a demon. She pressed herself against the wall, pointing and shouting, "Monster, monster!" and everyone feared she might lose her sanity altogether. Frederick's anatomy, described by onlookers as resembling a large club with a slender handle, was beyond anything the sheltered princess could have imagined. Its sheer size terrified her, but the odd shape, the way it bent and spiraled, the strange lumps along its length, and the almost alien form of the entire organ utterly shattered her composure. What followed was far from a romantic wedding night, and resembled more of a medical intervention. Frederick's doctors, specially trained for such matters, had to be summoned to inform the shocked Mary Christine about what lay ahead. Cushions were carefully positioned, oils applied, and a procedure commenced that felt more like surgery than an act of love. Private letters exchanged between court physicians reveal a scene filled with almost unreal dysfunction. Frederick needed a uniquely crafted pillow to support his large member, ensuring it would not harm him during intimate moments. Despite all these precautions, the experience was so distressing for Mary Christine that she had to rely on laudanum to endure it. The emotional toll on both was immense. Frederick, already filled with paranoia and insecurity about his condition, became even more troubled when confronted with his wife's visible disgust. Mary Christine developed what today would be identified as severe sexual trauma. She began increasing her laudanum doses, eventually growing dependent on it as her means to escape the torment of her conjugal obligations. Their efforts to conceive became a ritual of horror, repeating with heartbreaking consistency. Each time Frederick called his physicians, who would ready the chamber with its specialized apparatus. Mary Christine was given enough laudanum to make her submissive, yet avoid a catatonic state. The entire procedure was a tragic ordeal. The encounters were carried out with precise efficiency, after which both individuals would withdraw to different sections of the palace to recover from their ordeal. As months turned into years without a successful pregnancy, Frederick's frustration escalated to new levels. He became certain that his wife's visible aversion was somehow blocking conception and began trying out increasingly strange techniques to overcome what he considered her feminine inability. Historical court documents show that Frederick commissioned special restraints designed to keep Mary Antonia firmly in place during their private moments, preventing her from pulling away or showing her disgust. These leather and silk devices were made by the same craftsmen responsible for the king's saddles and hunting gear, adding a chilling aspect to the royal workshops. Frederick also grew obsessed with scheduling their encounters based on astrological charts and lunar phases. He sought guidance from astronomers, astrologers, and even dark arts practitioners who claimed they could align the stars to favor royal conception. The palace soon became a refuge for frauds promoting fertility potions, enchanted charms, and ritual ceremonies, all promising to circumvent the curse of Frederick's malformed anatomy. One particularly desperate episode saw Frederick consulting a wandering mystic from the East who convinced him that the unusual form of his member was actually a symbol of. Frederick believed he possessed divine favor, having been blessed with the dragon's rod, requiring only the proper rituals to unlock its fertility. For 3 months, Frederick and his wife underwent strange ceremonies involving incense, chanting, and positions said to be based on ancient Chinese texts. Twice, miraculously, Mary Christine became pregnant. The court celebrated, Frederick's confidence grew, and all of Spain anxiously awaited the arrival of an heir to the throne. However, both pregnancies ended in devastating miscarriages that left the royal couple more shattered than ever. The first miscarriage, in the year 1804, happened during the 4th month of pregnancy. Court physicians attributed it to the unusual strain on Her Majesty's fragile health. What they implied, but could not voice, was that Frederick's anatomical condition made intercourse so traumatic that Mary Christine's body could not carry the pregnancy to term. The second miscarriage, in 1805, was even more heartbreaking. This time Mary Christine almost reached full term before losing the child in a labor so difficult and bloody it nearly took her life. The Queen never fully recovered from this trauma, and her dependence on laudanum became so severe she was essentially a shadow of herself during the last 2 years of her life. Frederick's response to these tragedies exposed the true depths of his suffering and despair. Selfishness and cruelty shaped his actions. Rather than any sympathy for his wife's agony, he became convinced that she was intentionally undermining their chances of having a child. He alleged she took substances to avoid pregnancy, deliberately behaved in ways that would provoke miscarriages, and secretly held liberal beliefs that made her reluctant to give Spain a legitimate Catholic heir. Such whispers echoing through the palace halls shattered the fragile mental state Mary Antonia still had. She started to believe she was truly cursed, that her body rejected Frederick's seed because of some secret sin or divine wrath. Her final months passed in near constant prayer, pleading for forgiveness for sins she could not identify and crimes she never committed. When Mary Antonia died in May of the year 1807, at only the age of 21, the official reason was marked as fever and complications due to her fragile health. However, the reality was far more sinister. She had essentially succumbed to despair, her body and mind ravaged by prolonged sexual trauma, drug dependency, and emotional cruelty. Yet even in death, Mary Antonia could not escape Frederick's disturbed paranoia. Soon rumors spread claiming she was poisoned, not by enemies in politics but by Frederick himself, who had grown weary of her disappointments as a spouse, and wished to begin anew with another wife who might succeed in bearing an heir. Rumors grew stronger after the suspicious death of the palace pharmacist who was discovered lifeless in his rooms only a few days following Mary Antonia's demise. He had left an enigmatic letter that was promptly confiscated by Frederick's agents and vanished without a trace. Some whispered that the note contained admissions about poisons given to the Queen. Others believed it exposed the real nature of Frederick's illness and the unbearable demands imposed on his spouse. Frederick's conduct after Mary Antonia's death revealed much. Though he exhibited the expected public mourning, in private he appeared almost relieved. Within weeks he began investigating potential second wives, concentrating mainly on women proven to be fertile through children from prior marriages. Meanwhile, the king's doctors were scrambling to find new remedies for his condition. To ensure a successful remarriage, they needed solutions to make physical intimacy less painful for future queens. This urgency sparked some of the most unusual medical experiments ever recorded in royal history. Physicians worked to invent increasingly complex marital aids and pioneer novel surgical methods aimed at altering Frederick's body. As he neared his second wedding, the king's personality had already developed the distorted characteristics that would later earn him a place among history's most reviled rulers. The sexual trauma from his first marriage, coupled with his ongoing struggles, shaped his darkened temperament. Deep-rooted doubts about his physical state had shaped a man who was incapable of genuine emotional connection or compassion. Frederick came to view others not as individuals with their own emotions and desires, but as instruments to serve his gratification or barriers to be removed. His first spouse had been an instrument that failed to perform adequately and thus had to be cast aside. His subjects were means to sustain his authority and satisfy his vanity. Anyone opposing him was regarded as a hindrance that needed elimination. The prince's dealings with the palace employees revealed a rising cruelty. He started challenging the extent of his authority by issuing progressively arbitrary and harsh commands. Servants who accidentally saw him unclothed were not merely dismissed, but frequently vanished altogether. Guards who failed to uphold strict confidentiality concerning the royal quarters were reassigned to the most perilous border areas within Spain's declining empire. Frederick also became fixated on the belief that people were constantly ridiculing him in secret. This was not purely irrational, as people genuinely spoke about his condition, but Frederick's reaction was excessive and increasingly aggressive. He began compiling lists of alleged mockers and devising intricate revenge plans to carry out once he regained full control. By the year 1807, Frederick had become the focal point of a complicated conspiracy involving several key figures in Spain. Some of the most influential nobles and high-ranking military officers viewed the prince as their instrument to topple the ineffective government of Charles IV and his despised minister Michael Godfrey. What they failed to realize was that they were aligning themselves with a man whose sexual complications had led to a personality disorder, which would eventually prove more threatening than the inefficiency they aimed to eliminate. This group of conspirators called themselves the Fredericks and worked relentlessly to build Frederick's image as the favored one. They circulated rumors highlighting his intellect, patriotism, and potential as a reformist leader who could restore Spain's lost grandeur. What they deliberately hid was their increasing recognition of Frederick's mental instability and his growingly alarming attitude toward anyone opposing him. The plot reached its climax in October 1807 with the so-called El Escorial conspiracy, where Frederick was uncovered planning to overthrow his own father with Napoleon Bonaparte's assistance. Upon discovery of the scheme, Frederick's reaction showed not only his cowardice, but also his utter lack of loyalty to anyone, including his fellow conspirators. Instead of supporting those who had risked everything for his agenda, Frederick immediately betrayed them, providing detailed confessions about every detail of the conspiracy and naming all involved. Every participant pleaded and implored his parents for pardon, while his supporters encountered imprisonment and forced exile due to this treachery. This established a trajectory that would characterize Frederick's whole reign. He regularly exploited individuals to serve his interests, and then discarded them as soon as it suited him. During the unfolding of Frederick's political intrigues, his health was deteriorating rapidly. The royal doctors observed that his member kept enlarging and altering its form, developing new anomalies that made physical intimacy increasingly difficult. Some medical scholars propose that Frederick might have been afflicted with a rare disorder called megalosia, a hormonal condition that results in continuous growth of male genitalia well into adulthood. Regardless of the precise diagnosis, the practical outcome was unmistakable. Frederick would require progressively advanced apparatuses and wives more yielding in order to father an heir. This need gave rise to one of the darkest features of his later unions: the intentional choice of women susceptible to psychological control or physical compulsion to meet his demands. Meanwhile, the palace artisans had become experts in crafting increasingly intricate marital devices. Their workshops, concealed deep within the royal residence, resembled a strange fusion of a medical research center and a torture chamber where they engineered. Adjustable cushions, restraining devices, and diverse instruments were created to facilitate Frederick's intimate encounters while reducing the harm inflicted on his partners. The craftsmen responsible for these creations pledged complete secrecy, and Frederick ensured their silence by combining generous payments with severe threats. Several artisans who contributed to these projects mysteriously died later, prompting whispers that Frederick had them eliminated to avoid any chance of revealing the true purpose of their work. When Napoleon invaded Spain in 1808 and compelled Frederick to abdicate, the future king found himself in an exceptionally humiliating situation. He had not only lost his throne, but was now a captive whose captor was undoubtedly aware of his embarrassing medical condition. French intelligence maintained detailed records on the Spanish royal family, which certainly included information about Frederick's anatomical irregularity. During Frederick's 6-year imprisonment at the Château de Valence, he underwent continuous medical experimentation as French doctors observed his condition with scientific interest. Freed from the royal protocols that constrained their Spanish counterparts, these physicians conducted rigorous examinations and treatments that nearly bordered on torture. The French medical documents uncovered in Napoleonic archives centuries later offer the most comprehensive clinical account of his condition. Frederick's condition is unlike any ever documented. Medical experts described a sexual organ so enormous and distorted it appeared more fitting for a mythical being than a human monarch. French physicians speculated that Frederick's ailment stemmed from several genetic disorders merging in one person, creating what they termed a perfect convergence of anatomical abnormalities. Throughout his imprisonment, Frederick also learned that various Spanish nobles and military commanders were risking their lives to bring him back to power. The paradox was striking. Brave fighters perished in muddy trenches and rugged mountain paths to reinstate a king whose main obsession was discovering new ways to handle his intimate dysfunction and father an heir to continue his ill-fated lineage. During his years in exile, Frederick wrote numerous letters to European royals searching for potential brides who might accept his unusual condition. These handwritten appeals reveal a man entirely detached from the anguish of his nation, consumed only with his personal issues. While Spain was engulfed in conflict, Frederick was planning his next wedding night. When Frederick finally returned to Spain in 1814, the crowds that welcomed him were unlike anything Europe had encountered before. People showered him with flowers, wept joyfully, and knelt as his carriage passed by. Children born during the war caught their first sight of the king their parents had died trying to restore. The very stones of Madrid seemed to rejoice with. Frederick smiled and waved from his carriage, yet his thoughts were already consumed by more private matters. His top priority was not ruling Spain or rewarding those who had supported his restoration. Instead, it was finding a new wife who could finally provide the heir he had long been denied. The king's homecoming also marked the onset of what scholars refer to as the troubling decade. However, the true trouble did not lie solely in Frederick's political oppression, but emerged in his increasingly desperate and unusual efforts to fulfill his royal obligation of fathering a successor. His sexual difficulties had become intertwined with his political failures, producing a ruler whose personal flaws led to a national disaster. Frederick's initial act upon reclaiming the throne was to order a completely new array of marital aids crafted by Europe's finest artisans. He dispatched agents to Germany, Italy, and even the Ottoman Empire, searching for specialists in creating devices suited for delicate royal issues. The collection that resulted, concealed in secret palace chambers, stood as the finest example of twisted ingenuity that the early 19th century could offer. Frederick's second spouse was Mary Christine of Portugal, another cousin caught in the relentless cycle of royal intermarriage that plagued his lineage. She was 19 upon her arrival at the Spanish court in 1816, carrying the innocent optimism common to young princesses entering these arranged unions. The court doctors She had already informed her ladies-in-waiting about the unusual arrangements necessary for the wedding night, but nothing could truly prepare Isabel for the reality she faced. The wedding ceremony itself was an extravagant display of Baroque opulence intended to conceal the mounting despair of a king whose rule was becoming increasingly linked to failure. Frederick stood at the altar, adorned in fabric of gold, his expression a mask of barely suppressed anxiety. He had spent the previous 7 days consulting physicians, alchemists, and even a mysterious figure rumored to be an Ottoman expert in royal issues who had come to Madrid under cover of darkness. The wedding night turned into a catastrophe that would haunt both parties throughout their brief time together. Despite all the preparations, the countless devices, and the consultations with specialists from across Europe, Frederick's physical condition remained an insurmountable obstacle. The screams that echoed through the palace halls that night were not those of passion, but of pure fear and agony. The servants discovered blood-stained sheets and shattered furniture, clear signs of an encounter that resembled a medieval torture ordeal rather than the romantic joining of royalty. Isabel never truly recovered from that first night. Those at court noticed she developed a marked stammer and would visibly flinch each time Frederick entered a room. She started suffering from what palace doctors referred to as hysterical fits would now be understood as manifestations of severe psychological trauma. Her attendants often reported that she would awaken screaming from nightmares, calling out warnings about the creature that haunted her sleep. Frederick, on the other hand, saw his wife's fear as a direct affront to his royal honor. His already infamous paranoia escalated as he became convinced that Isabel was secretly working with foreign adversaries to ridicule his condition. He started having her letters intercepted, her meals tested for toxins, and her rooms searched for signs of treason. The king's intimate difficulties evolved into a political madness that tainted every part of his reign. The demand to have an heir turned into a fixation that overwhelmed both the royal couple and the Spanish court. Frederick arranged a series of increasingly strange medical evaluations, gathering doctors, anatomists, and even circus performers who claimed expertise in unusual anatomical issues. The royal bedchamber transformed into a testing ground of sexual experiments that challenged the limits of human patience and respect. A particularly chilling episode is recorded in the private journal of a court physician from that era, detailing Frederick's choice to bring in foreign specialists to witness his attempts at procreation. In his desperation to find answers, the king permitted German anatomists and French doctors were invited to observe Frederick's private troubles, turning his marital chamber into a disturbing medical stage. These experts carefully documented their observations and created drawings that were later distributed throughout European medical schools, transforming Frederick's sexual dysfunction into a subject of scholarly examination across the continent. Mary Christine, exposed to this invasive display of voyeuristic medical investigation, began to show signs of a total psychological breakdown. She stopped eating regularly, lost dangerously large amounts of weight, and developed a vacant stare that the servants found more terrifying than her previous emotional outbursts. The young queen had become a spectral presence, haunting the corridors of a palace that felt more like a prison to her. The political fallout of Frederick's private troubles was becoming impossible to overlook. Spain's American colonies, already rebelling, pointed to their monarch's failure to produce legitimate heirs as proof of divine displeasure with the Bourbon dynasty. Revolutionary propaganda portrayed Frederick as a sexually powerless tyrant whose physical deficiencies mirrored his political ineptitude. The king's most intimate humiliation turned into a rallying cry for independence movements stretching from Mexico to Argentina. Frederick's reaction to these threats was typically paranoid and ruthless. He initiated a fresh series of purges aimed at anyone suspected of spreading gossip about his condition or supporting colonial rebellion. The Inquisition, upon regaining his authority, Frederick initiated inquiries into allegations of sexual defamation against the monarchy, fostering an atmosphere of fear where even intimate talks between spouses could lead to incarceration or death. His fixation on confidentiality grew to ridiculous levels. He commanded the creation of secret corridors inside the palace to move from his rooms to Mary Christine's without servants noticing. He arranged mirrors at key positions to spot any spies and hired a group of informants solely dedicated to tracking palace rumors concerning the royal marriage. At the same time, Mary Christine's condition worsened under the dual torment of her husband's sexual abuse and mental intimidation. The palace doctors observed that she experienced what they described as false pregnancies, intervals during which she showed symptoms of expecting a child despite the impossibility of conception. These incidents seemed to offer Frederick fleeting moments of optimism, followed by devastating sorrow once reality set in. The false pregnancies of the Queen turned into a cruel joke within an already dysfunctional court. Servants murmured about how the king would pace anxiously outside Mary Christine's chambers during these phases, alternately pleading and swearing, as if a higher power might overturn the fundamental impossibility he faced. When every false pregnancy inevitably concluded, despair returned. Frederick would fall into deep bouts of despair that would incapacitate the government for weeks at a stretch. In the year 1818, after enduring 2 years of this dreadful marriage, Isabel finally found her escape through the only option available to royal women of her time: death. She gave in to what the court doctors politely described as nervous exhaustion. However, personal letters from palace staff hint that she might have deliberately hastened her passing using subtle self-inflicted harm. According to her confessor, her last words were a prayer of thanks for the freedom that awaited her. Frederick's response to Isabel's death exposed the full depth of his mental collapse. Instead of grieving, he became convinced that his wife had been assassinated by adversaries eager to stop him from fathering an heir. He demanded multiple autopsies, searched for traces of poison, and ordered the arrest of several ladies-in-waiting under suspicion of plotting against them. The king's sorrow was indistinguishable from his paranoia, creating a vicious cycle of anger and mistrust that overwhelmed everyone near him. Queen Isabel's funeral turned into a grim spectacle that shocked even Frederick's supporters. The king insisted on viewing her body repeatedly during its preparation. He touched the corpse, murmuring about the lost potential of her womb. He commissioned a death mask, which he displayed in his private quarters, where guests reported seeing him engaged in strange rituals. In his conversations with the expressionless face of his departed wife, Frederick's determination to secure an heir could not be postponed by sorrow or madness. Within a few months of Isabel's funeral, his advisors were already arranging talks for a third marriage. The main obstacle now was locating a European princess ready to wed a king whose former spouses had met such tragic ends and whose personal oddities were becoming infamous throughout the continent. Negotiations turned out to be more challenging than anticipated. Several potential brides withdrew after private meetings with doctors who had served at the Spanish court. Others demanded unprecedented privileges, including the right to have separate living quarters and their own personal security guards. Frederick's sexual inability had become a diplomatic burden threatening to alienate Spain from future allies. Eventually, the king's representatives discovered Mary Christine Joseph Amalia of Saxony, a princess from Saxony whose family's desperate financial troubles made them willing to disregard Frederick's infamous reputation. Mary Christine was 24 when she arrived in Madrid in 1819. She was older and more experienced than Isabel had been, yet she carried the same ill-fated hope that had marked her predecessor's arrivals. The third wedding was notably more restrained, reflecting both Frederick's growing age and the court's weariness of royal marriage disasters. The event featured fewer foreign dignitaries and far less extravagance than before. Festivities filled the air, yet beneath the surface lay a strong feeling that everyone was simply performing a ritual that had already failed on 2 occasions before. Mary Christine had prepared herself far better for the ordeal than Isabel had, having received extensive consultations from Saxon doctors who had worked closely with their Spanish equivalents. She brought along a personal collection of medical instruments and remedies, as well as a private physician specializing in challenging marital circumstances. Her perspective on the marriage was more analytical than sentimental, treating her royal responsibilities like a medical puzzle to be resolved using scientific methods. This pragmatic stance benefited her more than Isabel's romantic innocence, yet it could not alter the fundamental impossibility of Frederick's condition. The third marriage settled into a routine of carefully orchestrated efforts at intimacy, with encounters planned meticulously and supervised medically, appearing more like surgical operations than genuine acts of conjugal warmth. Mary Christine maintained thorough documentation of these sessions, recording times, methods, and results with the exactness of a laboratory scientist. The Queen's emotional detachment appeared to irritate Frederick even more than Isabel's fear had. He grew suspicious that Mary Christine saw him as a medical specimen rather than a spouse, and his paranoia deepened to the point where he feared she was secretly recording his condition for foreign intelligence agents, the king's network of spies. It was revealed that the Queen kept in touch extensively with Saxon court doctors, sharing what Frederick believed were confidential details about his health. Meanwhile, Spain continued to deteriorate under the burden of Frederick's mismanagement. One after another, the American colonies gained independence, taking with them the riches that had supported the Spanish Empire for 300 years. The king's preoccupation with his sexual troubles rendered him helpless in dealing with the political and economic disasters dismantling his realm. Important meetings in the cabinet were postponed when Frederick faced difficulties with his wife, and crucial choices were delayed for weeks while the king sought advice from doctors on new methods to conceive. Initially, the Spanish people were thankful for Frederick's return, but they soon realized the heavy price their restored monarch demanded. Revolts brewed in the cities as bandits dominated rural areas. The king's subjects suffered hunger while he squandered huge sums on sexual aids and foreign medical experts. Spain had become a subject of ridicule in Europe. Its decline was embodied by a monarch whose most private shortcomings had become public knowledge. In 1829, after 10 years of a barren marriage, Mary Joseph accomplished what many thought impossible. She became pregnant. The news sent shockwaves through the Spanish court and across Europe, stirring a frenzy of diplomatic speculation. There was much speculation about how Frederick had finally overcome his anatomical challenges. Some believed it was divine intervention, others attributed it to progress in medical science, while the most skeptical murmured about unfaithfulness and questionable lineage. Frederick's response to the pregnancy was a blend of overwhelming joy and intense fear. He employed extra guards to ensure Mary Christine's safety. Michael Joseph summoned the best doctors from all over Europe and had her rooms consecrated by every religious official in Madrid. The king's frantic desire to protect this miraculous pregnancy verged on insanity, as he convinced himself that foes would try to harm his eagerly awaited heir by supernatural or scientific methods. The pregnancy proceeded uneventfully until the 7th month, when Mary Christine began experiencing health problems that palace doctors could not explain. Contemporary medical understanding suggests she suffered from placental abruption, a complication that could have been managed with adequate care. However, Frederick's meddling in her treatment, demanding consultations with mystics and alchemists, along with conventional physicians, created confusion that prevented effective care. On the 18th of May, 1829, Mary Christine went into premature labor. The childbirth turned into a nightmare, traumatizing all present since Frederick insisted on overseeing the process himself despite having no medical expertise. The infant, a daughter, survived only a few moments. Several hours before ultimately succumbing to the complications caused by an early birth, Mary Josephine survived the delivery, but never regained her strength. She passed away 3 weeks later from what medical experts described as childbed fever, though it was more likely a combination of infection and deep despair. Frederick's response to this devastating double loss exposed a complete collapse of his mental state. He refused to permit either body to be buried, insisting that the court physicians continue their attempts to bring both mother and child back to life through increasingly strange and desperate methods. For nearly a week, the palace was overwhelmed by the foul odor of decay, as the king denied the truth of his losses and ordered his medical team to perform impossible acts of revival. When Frederick finally came to accept that his wife and daughter had died, he sank into such a profound depression that those at court feared for his very survival. He stopped eating, refused to meet with his advisors, and spent his days gazing at the death masks he had commissioned for each of his 3 wives. The king had transformed into a living specter, haunting his own residence as Spain deteriorated around him. Yet fate had one last cruel twist reserved for Frederick III. In the year 1829, at the age of 45, the monarch who had spent many years unable to produce a living heir suddenly found himself confronted with an unexpected 4th marriage. His advisors, desperate to bring stability to a kingdom on the brink of collapse, had identified Mary Christine of Naples as a suitable bride, although this was kept from Frederick until after the arrangements were underway. The marriage negotiations were already finished, but it turned out that Mary Christine was expecting a child by another man when she arrived in Madrid. The wedding in 1829 was a farce that nobody was fooled by. Mary Christine was clearly with child as she walked down the aisle carrying an unborn child that could not possibly be Frederick's. The king, however, was so eager for an heir that he accepted this clear deception, convinced that some higher force had finally answered his prayers in an unexpected way. The birth of Isabella II in 1830 should have been the end of Frederick's worries about succession. Instead, it opened up new concerns. Though the king knew the child was not his biological offspring, he felt compelled to uphold the appearance of legitimacy to protect his family line. His relationship with Mary Christine was founded on shared falsehoods. She acted as if she respected him, while he pretended to believe her child was truly his. Frederick's last years were characterized by the same sexual difficulties that had plagued his adult life, but now with the extra stress of sustaining a false claim to the throne. Desperately trying to conceive a genuine heir, he continued to seek intimacy with Mary Christine. These efforts, watched over by a series of doctors and specialists who had witnessed his earlier disappointments, became increasingly pitiable as his age advanced. The chances of success grew increasingly slim. The paranoia that engulfed Frederick's final years showed itself in shocking ways, even to the skeptical courtiers who had witnessed many years of royal madness. The king started carrying out random searches of his wife's rooms at all times, bursting through doors with armed guards to catch Mary Christine in supposed acts of betrayal. These late-night raids terrified the queen's attendants, who never knew when they might face a wild-eyed ruler accusing them of plotting. Frederick's fixation on spying reached absurd extremes. He had peepholes installed in the walls separating his chambers from Mary Christine's, spending hours watching her through these crude openings like a disturbed voyeur. Palace staff reported seeing the king's eye pressed against these holes during the queen's most private moments, whether she was nursing their daughter, praying, or lost in thought. Aware of this relentless surveillance, Mary Christine began moving through her rooms like a captive, carefully guarding every look and action. The rituals around tasting food turned into elaborate ceremonies steeped in mistrust, often delaying meals for hours. Frederick demanded that not only every dish be tested, but that the tasters wait for 30 minutes between tasting and serving to make certain any slow-acting poison would reveal itself. The king closely observed the unfortunate servants during this process. With the sharp focus of a hawk watching its prey, they examined faces for any trace of unease that could suggest poisoning. Several tasters collapsed from overwhelming nervous tension under this relentless observation, which only strengthened Frederick's conviction that attempts on his life were imminent. Mary Christine, caught in this net of suspicion, began exhibiting the same mental decline that had affected Frederick's former wives. Letters she wrote to her relatives in Naples, intercepted and read by the king's agents, revealed a woman gradually unraveling. She described feeling perpetually surveilled, startled by shadows, and unable to place trust even in her own attendants. The queen portrayed her existence as living inside a fragile enclosure where every action was scrutinized for signs of rebellion. The king's paranoia reached beyond his family, engulfing the entire court. He started changing his personal guards each day, convinced that long service would lead to betrayal by foreign spies. Ministers in the cabinet faced loyalty challenges that bordered on farce. Frederick would deliberately make conflicting statements during private discussions to see if any minister corrected him, interpreting disagreement as proof of disloyalty. The Spanish court, once admired across Europe for its elegance and cultural refinement, had deteriorated into a strange stage of constant mutual suspicion. Courtiers developed a secretive way of speaking to avoid direct confrontation or revealing anything that might be used against them. Maintaining eye contact with the king required carrying oneself with the careful impartiality of envoys in hostile surroundings. Conversations were exchanged in hushed tones. Alliances were made and broken depending on perceived loyalty to rival groups, and everyone realized that a thoughtless remark could lead to imprisonment or banishment. Frederick's bond with his infant daughter Isabella became another cause of deep psychological distress. Although he was aware she was not biologically his, he loved her as his successor while simultaneously resenting her as a reminder of his own sexual inadequacy. The king would spend countless hours gazing at the child, searching her face for any trace of likeness to himself or potential fathers. He ordered artists to create detailed portraits of Isabella at various stages of infancy, then compared these images to paintings of himself and Mary Christine's former lovers. The question of Isabella's paternity haunted Frederick with special intensity because it symbolized the ultimate confirmation of his sexual failure. Here was a child destined to inherit his throne only because he had been incapable of producing legitimate heirs. The bitter irony did not escape him that his greatest political achievement, securing the line of succession, was also his most devastating personal defeat. This contradiction consumed him like a corrosive poison, tainting the rare, joyful moments with his daughter. Frederick even sought advice from genealogists and scholars. Physiologists eager to discover scientific evidence that would confirm Isabella's legitimacy and alleviate his doubts approached the challenge with great caution. These specialists, fully aware of the risks involved in their mission, offered carefully vague opinions that could be understood as supporting whichever conclusion the king desired. Their documented analyses, now kept in the palace archives, demonstrate the desperate ingenuity of scholars struggling to meet an impossible royal demand while ensuring their own safety. The king's attempts to exert control over his wife's actions became progressively more detailed and intrusive. He appointed certain servants to surveil Mary Christine's correspondence, ordering them to report not only the content of her letters, but also her facial expressions as she composed them. Frederick insisted on receiving exhaustive reports on the Queen's daily routines, including the time spent in prayer, the books she read, and the courtiers she interacted with during official events. Mary Christine's efforts to preserve a sense of normalcy in her royal life under such scrutiny required exceptional mental resilience. She mastered the art of separating her true feelings, showing a composed exterior in public while privately enduring the relentless pressure of surveillance. Her personal diary, found centuries later concealed behind a secret wall in her chambers, reveals the heavy psychological burden this monitoring inflicted. She wrote about feeling like an actress who must never break character, even in dreams. The far-reaching consequences of Frederick's growing suspicion started to impact Spain's diplomatic ties significantly. Foreign envoys reported back to their home countries about the king's unpredictable conduct and the volatile atmosphere within his court. Negotiations aimed at forming European alliances came to a halt as potential allies doubted Spain's ability to fulfill long-term agreements under such erratic leadership. Frederick's personal instability was increasingly becoming a global issue. His fixation on uncovering assassination schemes led him to interpret even ordinary actions as secret plots. When Mary Christine asked to redecorate her private chambers, he suspected she might be trying to hide weapons or poison. Compliments from courtiers about the Queen's looks made the king question if those praises contained hidden, treacherous messages. Even religious practices drew suspicion from Frederick. He wondered whether Mary Christine's heightened religious devotion was sincere or a covert way to communicate with foreign Catholic powers. The financial toll of Frederick's paranoia was immense. The monarchy poured vast amounts of money into security arrangements, espionage networks, and loyalty probes, while Spain's treasury drained and its citizens endured hardships. The king ordered secret passageways to be built throughout the palace, installed complex alarm systems, and kept a constant watch over everyone around him. Several groups of food tasters, guards, and attendants worked simultaneously to prevent any single faction from conspiring against him. These measures consumed resources that could have been allocated to tackle Spain's growing financial turmoil. Frederick's health started to decline due to the relentless pressure of sustaining his surveillance regime. The royal doctors observed that the monarch suffered from ongoing sleeplessness, digestive troubles, and what they described as nervous unrest. His paranoia triggered a vicious cycle, where his anxieties led to actions that only confirmed his fears, continually intensifying his state of suspicion and distress. The king's bonds with his last remaining family members suffered as a result of his worsening mental condition. He began to doubt even his closest kin of schemes directed against him, misreading ordinary family moments as possible threats. Festive occasions like birthdays became uncomfortable events, as Frederick searched for hints of conspiracy in the arrangement of flowers or the choice of presents. Even his brother Don Carlos, who had stood by him in earlier hardships, became subject to scrutiny and monitoring. Mary Christine's attempts to protect their daughter from Frederick's mistrust sparked further disputes. The king viewed the queen's maternal care as proof that she was preparing Mary Louise Palmer to rule under the influence of foreign interests. When Mary Christine asked for some private moments with her daughter, while Frederick speculated about what rebellious thoughts she might be instilling in the child's mind. What should have been a tender moment of motherly affection instead became yet another battlefield in the king's imagined struggle against treason. Those servants closest to the royal household found themselves trapped in impossible dilemmas. They were forced to deliver detailed accounts of the queen's behaviors while pretending to be fully devoted servants. The immense stress led many to suffer from anxiety and other health issues, which in turn caused a high turnover rate among staff, making the court even more unstable. New employees, unaware of the delicate balance of trust and expectations within the palace, frequently made innocent errors that triggered Frederick's growing doubts. His efforts to uncover the true identity of Isabella's father grew more relentless and invasive by the day. He ordered investigators to create extensive dossiers on every man who had been in contact with Mary Christine during her stay in Naples, looking for any physical traits resembling his daughter's. The search did not stop there. They examined medical histories, genealogies, and even scrutinized personal letters written long before Isabella had been conceived. The king's private chamber gradually transformed into a shrine of his broken marriages, adorned with portraits of his deceased wives and medical instruments meant to document his sexual shortcomings. He was unable to address his anatomical difficulties and placed his hope for divine intervention in religious relics. Visitors to these private rooms described an atmosphere thick with desperate sorrow that seemed to linger like incense in the air. Frederick would hold meetings in this area, surrounded by reminders of his most personal defeats, while discussing state affairs. The mental strain on Mary Christine grew heavier as Frederick's actions became increasingly unpredictable. The queen began to exhibit physical signs of anxiety such as hair thinning, fluctuating weight, and trembling, which she endeavored to conceal during public events. Her ladies-in-waiting observed that she developed nervous behaviors, frequently looking behind her and being startled by sudden noises. Frederick's paranoia reached a strange peak in the year 1832, when he became convinced that Mary Christine intended to poison him through close contact. The monarch started insisting that his wife undergo medical inspections before any physical interaction to detect any possible toxins that could be passed through skin contact. These examinations, performed by court doctors in Frederick's presence, marked the lowest point of their already deteriorating marriage. The global community observed Spain's slide into madness with a blend of intrigue and horror. Diplomatic circles were both captivated and disturbed by the unfolding tragedy. Correspondence from this era shows that European nations were actively preparing for the inevitable downfall of Frederick's administration. Aware that the king's personal instability made consistent governance unattainable, some countries began covertly backing regional independence efforts within Spain. They believed that breaking apart the Spanish Empire was a better outcome than leaving it in the hands of an unreliable ruler. As the year 1833 arrived, Frederick's physical condition finally mirrored the mental toll of his suspicious reign. His court doctors observed that the king had developed a persistent tremble, ongoing digestive troubles, and what seemed like early indications of mental deterioration. His speeches became disjointed monologues, filled with accusations toward unnamed adversaries and mentions of conspiracies that existed solely in his imagination. When the end arrived, it was almost anticlimactic. After many years of intense dysfunction, Frederick simply began to fade away, his body ultimately overwhelmed by the accumulated burden of a lifetime spent battling his own mind and body. In his final moments, he fluctuated between awareness and hallucination, at times calling out to his deceased wives, and at others issuing commands to investigate plots that never existed. In 1833, Frederick II quietly found the peace that had eluded him throughout his life, granted by the simple fact of death. The official cause was recorded as gout, but the royal doctors. It was privately admitted that the monarch had effectively succumbed to exhaustion, physical, psychological, and spiritual fatigue. This condition was caused by many years of sexual frustration alongside political fear. The post-mortem examination of Frederick II, performed discreetly by the very doctors who had spent countless years attempting to understand his unique anatomy, revealed the full scope of nature's harsh irony. The king's organ, preserved for scientific research, measured an impressive 14 inches in length and displayed significant variation in thickness from the base to the tip, precisely as contemporary accounts had described. More troubling was the finding of internal scars and deformities that rendered normal sexual function practically unattainable, providing a clear explanation for decades of disappointment and distress. Yet the examination uncovered an additional tragic detail: signs of intentional self-inflicted harm dating back to Frederick's teenage years. Apparently, the king had devoted many years to experimenting with various forms of self-surgery, hoping to alter his anatomy to enable typical intimacy. These sad, secret efforts, using whatever makeshift instruments he could find, only worsened his condition and compounded the psychological anguish already tied to his physical impairments. The preserved organ, together with meticulous medical illustrations and detailed notes, was locked away in the Vatican archives where it remains today. Church authorities considered the material too unsettling and politically delicate for public viewing. Exploring one of history's strangest state secrets, researchers who have gained access to these documents describe them as both intriguing and profoundly disturbing, offering insight into the private torment caused by absolute power warped by biological destiny. Frederick's demise signaled the conclusion of an epoch, yet his influence persisted in the divided Spain he left behind. Mary Christine, his daughter who may or may not have been his genetic offspring, inherited a nation devastated by civil conflict, financial ruin, and international disgrace. Once a formidable force on the global stage, the Spanish Empire was diminished to a minor power within Europe. This downfall was hastened by years of poor governance under a monarch whose personal fixations overshadowed his responsibilities to the public. The tale of Frederick II stands as a caution that power without prudence is perilous, but when mixed with personal instability, it can lead to disaster of immense scale. His rule illustrated how an individual's psychological struggles can spread and morph into collective suffering, how private humiliation can spiral into widespread catastrophe, and how deeply personal failures can reverberate across history with effects far beyond their initial impact. Most sorrowfully, Frederick's narrative uncovers the human toll of absolute rule, where the personal difficulties of a single individual determined the destiny of countless lives. His 3 deceased wives, his uncertain daughter, his frightened populace, and his shattered nation all bore the consequences of a genetic curse. A disastrous game of chance unfolded long before any of them ever lived. Frederick was both the agent and casualty of a system that concentrated excessive power in the hands of individuals completely unfit to manage it. When that royal doctor in the year 1834 concluded his grim duty of preserving Frederick's physical remains, he likely pondered the cruel irony of the situation. Here lay the tangible proof of a reign that devoured everything it encountered: spouses, offspring, subjects, and ultimately the monarch himself. The conserved organ was far more than a medical specimen. It stood as a testament to the ruinous effects of shame, the decay bred by unrestrained authority, and the heartbreaking loss of human promise. Ultimately, Frederick III gained a form of everlasting presence, but not the kind he had desired. His legacy endured not as a brilliant ruler or triumphant sovereign, but as a warning about the perils of allowing personal turmoil to be mistaken for political strength. His preserved remains, hidden away within the Vatican's vaults, act as a constant reminder that some mysteries are too unsettling for history to confront, too human for myth to accept, and too sorrowful for time to heal. The silk sheets that once cloaked his distorted body now covered a realm equally wounded and incapable of functioning as it was meant to. Frederick II had at last found tranquility, but he left behind a Spain destined to endure hardship. For many generations, people struggled to heal from the deeply personal calamities caused by his tumultuous rule. The most depraved monarch in history concluded his life just as he had spent it, becoming a continuous cause of pain for all who were unfortunate enough to be affected by his authority.